We're going to start now with John Blakemore, who is a little bit of a personal hero. He's also a man that I've known for a scarily long time, although kind of only through his work mostly. I've met him twice before. Once, I think, 7 years ago, and once in about 1980. I was deeply disappointed when we were discussing this yesterday that he didn't remember meeting me in 1980, obviously. He's been an inspiration to a huge number of photographers. He has a fantastic eye, a lovely feeling for light. He told me not to do a long introduction, so I don't suppose I'll go on for more than another 5 or 10 minutes here. No. John, would you join me on stage and wow everybody with your work?
If you need it.
Okay, thank you. I hate these things. I'll begin by apologising for my PowerPoint. PowerPoint is not my medium. If we were being marked for effort, I would probably get top. But if we're being marked on appearance, I wouldn't. Okay, what I decided to do today was to take you on a photographic journey, my photographic journey. It may have been a mistake because the journey is getting a bit too long. But we will dip into the landscape occasionally if the slides will change. Why aren't they changing, Tim?
Oh, that's because somebody's taken out the USB stick.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Ah, thank you. Okay, I'll go very quickly through my photographic beginnings, but this is where photography began for me. I was doing my national service in North Africa, and my mother sent me a copy of Picture Post, which had a selection of photographs from the family of man. So I sent and asked her to send me a copy of the book, which she did. This is all that remains of it. I'm not quite sure why, because I have books from the same period that are in better condition. But I saw the family of man. I looked at the images and I thought, I'm going to be a photographer. And I've been a photographer ever since. I'd never owned a camera, but I ordered one from Aden and I began photographing. So this first little section, which I'll go through very quickly, these were made in Tripoli with my first camera. I did photograph people with their eyes open on occasions, but I was intrigued that right at the beginning I began to collect images around a theme. And I was intrigued by people who took their siestas. So I did a series of siesta pictures. And then I came back and I had no idea how photography worked. I put together a portfolio and I went down to London to see photographic agencies. I didn't realise that they specialised, so I would take a documentary portfolio into somebody who only sold butterflies. And I was sent out very quickly. But then I went to Black Star Agency, and the guy in Black Star sat me down and talked to me and said, you can't print, but you've got a good eye, we'll use you. And I went back to Coventry where I lived, and I thought, I'll never hear from them again. And I got my first assignment the next morning. But I decided very quickly that I don't have a freelance temperament. I like to work on things for long periods of time. I like to be in control of what I'm doing. So I began working in studios, but apart from the studios, I did my own practice. And this was my first exhibition, which was held in 1964. It was photographing the area where I lived, which was Hillfields in Coventry. I lived there, I photographed there, I ran a portrait studio there. And now we're going to have a very strange shift. Because while I was making the documentary work, while I was running the portrait studio, I also began making colour photographs. They were in the landscape, but I didn't think of them as being landscape photographs. I thought of them as being about colour, about focus, about... I found it fascinating to look through a camera and use it like a kaleidoscope. So I couldn't say that's what I'm going to photograph. I had to look through the camera and discover it. So this carried on at the side of my documentary practice. And then I left Coventry. I didn't do any more documentary photography. I didn't really know what to do. In 1970, I went to Derby to teach, and I hadn't photographed very much for about a year. And then I was coming back from London on a trip with some students, and then we were talking about the creative block, the frozen finger. And they said, well, we're having an exhibition in 3 months, why don't you join us? So I said I would, and then of course I was haunted by these white walls, which I had the responsibility of filling. And the last significant experience for me had been spending a winter in Wales. I didn't photograph the landscape, but I walked in it a lot, and I wrote about it. And when I was confronted with this need to produce work, I thought I'd go back to Wales and photograph. This was a little later. For a long time I was a teacher, so one has to have the 3 R's. And how does one talk about photography to students? So these are my 3 R's. The first, relationship. It's really important to me that one works in the same period, the same place, with the same motif for long periods of time. That relationship is a sort of gathering a sort of intimacy with one's subject. I feel that if one goes to a place for the first time, you have preconceptions about the photographs you might make, and those are the ones you make. If you go back several times, for a year, for 2 years, for 6 years, then your relationship changes. Recognition. Recognition fascinates me. Minor White said the only creativity a photographer has is to say yes to an aspect of the world which you want to translate into image. Realization is the play of the process. And for me, for most of my period of working, that's been monochrome silver print. So realization is that play of the process, and the play of the process and the activity of picture making interlink and influence each other. So I just talk about that for a moment. If one saw a photographer walking through the landscape and you were watching, it would be perhaps a strange experience because they're carrying cumbersome things, struggling through the landscape. They stop occasionally, look at something, and then they shake their head and they move on. And then eventually they stop. And if you were just watching, you would say, well, how is that place different from the places that they walk past? But something has triggered you off. So looking at this photograph, this is mountainside in Wales where I photographed for quite a long time. I saw this in the distance, and what fascinated me was the curve of the rock and the tree growing from it. But when I got closer, I saw the twig just balanced on the rock in the foreground. And I'm fascinated by these moments of precarious poise. If I'd gone back in an hour, that twig would possibly have gone. The next day it certainly would. But for that moment, it's there. It's that moment of precariousness. And that was what made me stop to photograph. But I didn't want to photograph just that. I want to include the fallen branches from the previous season, the trees in the background, so that one got some sense of the process of which that twig was a part. And that notion of process, of the effect on the landscape of wind, water, time, is what interested me. This is from the first set of photographs that I called a sequence. It was called Wounds of Trees. And these were made in 71, so they were the first landscape photographs that I made. I didn't know precisely what I wanted to photograph, but I knew what I didn't want to photograph. I didn't want to photograph the grandiose. I wanted to focus on details which implied that process of the landscape. What I also realized with these was that the areas that I was photographing, which were showing the effect of time on the landscape, on the trees, was a metaphor for my own emotional state at that time, which was slightly precarious. And so I began to think about that relationship between the subject, the way that one photographed it, and one's own interior processes. I haven't got a whole sequence. The final sequence of this was about 12 images. The first one that I showed, that one was the central image. And the image on the left was the first image, the image on the right was the last, so there was this formal device that contained the flow of the images. I began photographing in Wales, where I was living in Derbyshire, and I didn't know the Derbyshire landscape at all, but then I gradually discovered it. This was a small stream about 30 miles north of Derby, and I photographed this stream for 6 years, and I never got more than about half a mile along it. And this was from my second sequence, which was called Metamorphoses. Metamorphosis for me had a number of different meanings. There was the physical metamorphosis of water, so water into ice, but also a personal metamorphosis in me. I talked about the sequence, and I've never really been interested in the single image. All of the work that I show you will belong in sequences. This is the same stream, but these were made about 5 years later. I thought I'd finished photographing the stream, but then in the early 70s I got my first Arts Council bursary, and it put a pressure on me. I hadn't made photographs for anyone but myself for a while, but I felt that I should do something extravagant, so I came to Scotland and did all sorts of things, and it didn't work for me at all. And after about a year, if I hadn't have already spent the money, I would have sent the cheque back to the Arts Council. But I couldn't because I had. And so I went back to my stream, because I thought, I've finished photographing, I won't make any more photographs, but I shall feel at peace there. And I bought a pair of waterproof boots the week before. And I had a rule to myself that whatever the weather, on a particular day, if I'd planned to go out, I would go. And I always went early because I like to experience the birth of the light. On this particular day, it was pouring with rain. But I got in my car and drove to the stream. And it was still raining. And then it stopped raining and the sun came out and the world gleamed and glittered. And I put my new boots on. And instead of walking up the bank of the stream, I walked in the stream. And it was a totally different experience. And I made this photograph, which was very important to me in thinking of my work as being about the landscape as energy. It's a very small stream, and most of one's length one could jump over it. And most of its length one could walk up it in Wellingtons and not get your feet wet. And what I like about these is the loss of scale, the sense of energy, the sense of force that a small detail can contain. From another sequence called Premonitions. Another moment of precarious poise. I photographed this beautiful bed of rock, and I went back to look for it again a few days later. It had gone, and I never saw it again. This is a small length of beach in Wales where I photographed for 7 years. Another sequence, this was called Emergence. I read an article, I can't remember who by, who was hypothesizing that mud and silt and so on preordained life forms, that it took the shape of emergent forms, and I made a sequence about this idea which intrigued me. Okay, we're now mid to late 70s. This is from an exhibition called Leela, which was on at the Photographer's Gallery in 1979. I'd been photographing the water for a long time, And I was thinking of alternative forms of energy that I could photograph, and I thought of photographing the wind. And it seemed a very simple idea. I thought I can walk into the landscape on a windy day, I can choose a suitable place, I can choose a long exposure, I could open my shutter, and that would be it. And it didn't work like that. I found a suitable place, I set up my camera, I worked out an exposure, I opened the shutter, and the wind stopped blowing. And at the length of the exposure finished, the wind started blowing. So I thought, I can make certain assumptions about wind and water behaving in the same way, but they don't. And I put the idea away for about 6 months, and I thought about it, and I watched the wind. And I came back to the landscape, and I decided that I would use multiple exposure, so that my exposure could take a minute, but I could break it down into segments. So if the wind stopped blowing, I could close my shutter and wait for it to blow again. This is fairly late, and see there are 30 exposures on this, so 30 exposures on the same negative. And this intrigues me because the making of the photograph becomes, to an extent, an equivalent to the process of time through the landscape. It's no longer an instantaneous moment, it's a period of time. Leela was organised in 4 sequences. The 3 that you've just seen are from the first sequence. And for me, they were about the way in which apparently diverse substances and surfaces become brought together by the activity of light. And so I was interested in the trees and the rock face, the trees' reflections, the water moving around the reflections, which echo the leaves working around the trees here, and the movement of wind. And the whole exhibition was organised through tonality. So this was the second sequence. It was a sequence that was about the wind. It began with very little wind movement, as in this image, and that movement gradually increased through the sequence. I was talking about the play of the medium. I had an exhibition in 1976 at the Arnolfini in Bristol, and I was fortunate that a lecturer in art history from the local university was asked to write a review. And we met and we became quite good friends. And the title of the exhibition that he saw in Bristol was Stand Before the World. And I thought of it as a celebration of the landscape. He said, it's not a celebration, it's a lament. And most of my prints at that time were very dark, very somber. And I thought about this, and I thought, well, I can move up the tonal scale. I can no longer overlay my own angst on the landscape. And so this sequence was the first time I began very consciously to do that. And I found it very difficult. When I first made these prints, I couldn't look at them. I didn't think a photograph should look like that. And then gradually, I became accustomed to them, and they became lighter and lighter. I'll have to have a drink of water. I'm losing my voice a little. I was fascinated by woodland on days of sunshine and wind. And it's very difficult to photograph. It's very difficult because of the very high contrast, the control of the exposures. This, excuse me, this was probably the first one that really worked for me. And I love the way that the space in the center bottom of the image just sort of dissolves into light. And this too was part of the Leela exhibition. This photograph was made in July. I tell you that because when the person had finished writing about my exhibition in Bristol, he sent me all his notes. And one of the notes said, there are no photographs made in July. So I phoned him up and said, Jonathan, what's this about no photographs made in July? And he said, well, you talk about celebration of forces of nature. July, nature's at its peak, and you don't photograph. So I made this for Jonathan. This was made in July. And in the exhibition, it was the central image. So there were two sequences, a space, this image, and then the third sequence and the fourth sequence. I suppose this one fascinates me because it becomes a total tapestry. You can see through the water, you can see there's things on the bottom of the water, you've got reflections, you've got the landscape that's being reflected. Ooh, what did I do, Tim? Oh, I pressed the wrong one. This was the third sequence, and this was really about the energy of light, but also about plant growth. So if you look carefully in these images, you will see immature ferns just unfurling. And in the center of the bottom, another one of these moments of precarious poise, something which happens for a brief period and then moves. Yeah, these were the adolescent ferns meeting, chatting, as adolescents do. And the final sequence for me was a sequence which became much darker. It was thinking of energy not just as a positive force, but also as a negative force, a force of destruction and decay. So I was photographing the same motifs that I photographed through the exhibition, but working with a different sort of emphasis. And then in 1981, I decided to stop working in the landscape. And I can say that very simply now. At the time, it was quite a traumatic decision, and I don't know whether it was the right decision or not. But I'm an image maker. I always make images. If I'm not making images, I'm not happy. And so I began working with still life. And I'd been working with the Wind series, which were quite complex images to make. So I wanted to go back to something very simple. So these were the first still lifes that I made. And then I discovered thistles, and the thistles were the first coherent body of still life work that I produced. I photographed thistles for a couple of years, and all the pieces of thistle came from two plants that I discovered in a neglected garden. I was fascinated by the variety of leaf forms that one could get from one plant. And I was interested in botanical drawing, the notion of the specimen, and the one on the right, which I saw as being that, I sold a print to a guy who came on a workshop with me, and he said for him it was the jewelry of the gods. So I think it's important to realize that what oneself feels about a photograph as the photographer doesn't contain its entirety. That other people will look at that photograph and will see totally different things. What do they look like from a distance? Can you see the edges? I can see them on the screen here.
You can see them on the right-hand one, but not so much on the left-hand one.
Yeah. Looks quite good here. This play with the medium, the play with tonality, has become, since the mid-70s, very important to me. And this Thistle series was the point where I probably pushed it to its greatest. So I can see the edges here, but I can't see them up there from this angle. I suppose I belong to the tradition of the fine print, and there's a definition, so one uses the medium to its fullness. One has all the possible tones from white to black, and everything on the image is described in terms of detail, intensity, and so on, and the image has a brightness. I began to question that, and I became interested in making photographs which use the tonal scale differently. If one thinks of the way in which it's normally described as black and white are the extremes of a symbol system in our culture. So when we make black and white images, we are plugging into that symbol structure. And so I want to play with tonality. I want to use tonality in as wide a way as I can. Okay, 1981, I'd been working for a year with still life. I suddenly had this urge to go back into the landscape. And I felt that I wanted to make something which became the finish of the Wind series. And I went into the landscape and I made 4 images. I think I've got all 4. I've only got 3 of them on the wall upstairs. Yes. And this series of 4 images became very important to me. They're probably still my favourite landscape photographs, because I saw the 4 as being a sort of journey into chaos. So I of course identified with the battered stump in the centre of the image there, and the path leads off and then the world descends into chaos. And on the one on the left, which is the second image of the 4, you still got this point where you can key into solidity, reality, the rock at the bottom centre. And then in the third image, everything dissolves, everything becomes chaos. And in the last one, you have the tree, which gives you this point at which you can anchor yourself again. This is not, of course, what the photographs are about. This is what they were about for me. This one was the most... I knew exactly where I was going to make that image before I got there. I was standing on the brink of a sort of basin making these, and I was looking down and I was trying to imagine what the multiple exposure was like. Each of these negatives had 48 exposures on it. I couldn't quite bring myself to go to 50. 50 seemed a little, I don't know, too much, over the top, so 48. And I could imagine those trees becoming clouds and sort of drifting off into the sky. And I remembered this next space and went and made a photograph where the trees do just that. They drift off into the sky. So still life and landscape, but perhaps the still life can come back with the landscape. So in the book that I made just after this, I sequenced the thistle and the landscape together, because it seemed to me that they were both about the same primal energy, but on a different scale. So when I began still life, I thought I was doing something totally different. It took me a time to realize that I wasn't, that there were links between the work that I was making with still life and the landscape imagery. Yeah, I put a few of these in. This was a commission that I did for the CPRE to photograph an area of outstanding natural beauty which had additional threats. This was an area near an old airfield in Lincolnshire, Fulbeck, which was a proposed nuclear dump site at that time. When I got there, I found that there was a very active protest group, and CPRE hadn't wanted me to photograph this, but I rang them up and said, if I can't include that, I'm resigning the commission. And I'd already resigned it once, so they said, oh, go on, then do it. So that was a little movement into the landscape about 1986. I hadn't been working in the landscape for 5 years, and I thought this might be a way back in, that I might want to carry on doing landscape work which had a political edge. But when I finished this, I found that I didn't want to do it anymore. So I stopped again. I thought I would have to show one or two tulips. For me, these photographs are not about tulips. They contain tulips, but they're not about tulips. And I photographed tulips fairly intensively for 10 years and then published a book. And for me, the book is a narrative vanitas. I said that I wanted to share with you a photographic journey. It moves in different directions. Very little of it is planned. So me working in the landscape seemed to be a very fortuitous response to a certain circumstance. The tulips were the same. At the time, I was doing a postgraduate diploma in film studies. So I was working on a degree course. It was a period when critical theory was very dominant, and I felt I had to learn more about it. And I thought if I did film studies, it shifted it just a little to the side of my own practice. But I love language. I probably love language more than images. And I enjoy writing sometimes, where I find it enormously difficult. And for this course, I had to write a 5,000-word essay every semester. And I found 5,000 words weren't enough, so I negotiated doing an 18,000-word essay and a 20,000-word essay. But I find writing difficult. So I was writing at this table, and then I was still writing, handwriting. You remember it? And I would sit at the table and I would write, and I would look at what I'd written and I'd think, no, and I would screw it up and throw it over my shoulder. And on a bad day, I would finish up with this circle of paper around me and nothing on the page in front of me. And you think, well, I should wash up or take the dog for a walk or dig the garden. And I hadn't got a dog, and I'd done the washing up, and the garden didn't need digging. And I thought, this is stupid. So I thought, what I'm trying to do is to find a position from which I can still be a photographer, because at that time I was doubting it. So I began photographing the space. But I didn't want to set up a large format camera, so I picked up my 35mm. I photographed the space, and purely by chance, there was a bowl of tulips in the space, and over a period of time, they became the dominant motif. In terms of familiarity that I talked about, there was the intensity of working for a long period of time. There was also a certain amount of historical research about the tulip, the representation of the tulip. So I saw the work as being about that historical system of representation, how that had changed and varied. And I began to work in ways which reflected that. So this was a subsequence called Celebrations. I did become very enamored of the tulip. It's a flower of amazing gesture. And I did have periods when I would just sit and look at tulips, not photograph them at all. But then I was also exploring the medium, also exploring tonality, ways of playing with tonality. People look at this print and they're not sure that they're looking at a photograph. And I like making prints that are on that edge of uncertainty. Studio table series. I was at the point where I knew the tulip book was going to be published later that year, and I felt that there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was. And I made a lot of negatives which had never been printed because I knew they were not what I wanted. And then I made the image on the right. I just walked into the room that I used as a studio, and I saw this leaf of the tulip coming over the edge there with the hammer. And I made this photograph, and I looked at it, and I thought, well, this could become the beginning of a series, because it was made very early in the tulip season. Everything's very pristine. And I thought if I photograph this table for the rest of the year, then I will have a narrative. And I also wanted to include things which I use when I'm making still life, like the roll of tape, the scissors, and so on, so that they became about the activity of picture making. Yeah, this is slightly out of the sequence that I wanted to talk about it in. Remember this one. It's a multiple exposure. Well, it's a double exposure, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. This was the last black and white tulip photograph that I made, and it's possibly one of my favourites. People ask me how I arranged it, and of course I can't say. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle with no picture. You know, you have a number of pieces, and you play with them until you think, yes, that's right, and you make the image. Yeah, Tulip Mania. Part of my research, I discovered Tulip Mania. There was a period in the 17th century when the tulip was an item of exchange and extreme value. And I was trying to imagine what the study of a tulipomaniac might have been like. And I thought, well, I've been a tulipomaniac for the last few years, so I made this. It's the second version. The first one, I'd made it in an alcove of my studio room. And it didn't have the sense of gravitas. So I have a friend who collects fabric, so I went round to see her, and I borrowed 2 pieces of fabric, and I lined the alcove, and I made the image again. And then that was the last image in the tulip book. It's called After Jan van Os. Jan van Os was a bouquet painter in Amsterdam and London in the 17th century. And I wanted to make a still life which used some of the elements that he used in his paintings. It was I'd left it too long. I'd had the idea of making it for a long time, and I hadn't done it. And I had a little woman in London who ran a florist at the side of, I can't remember the name of the church, St. Martin's in the Field. And I used to ring her up on Mondays and tell her what I wanted, and she would send me a parcel of tulips which arrived by train on Thursdays, and I went along and collect them. It was like a little Christmas. And I rang her up this week and I said, well, I want a lot of different, and she said, I can't do it. Tulip season's over. Can't send you that. So I went down to London and came back with an armful of tulips. And there are actually 3 vases here on different layers. And you can't arrange tulips. They're a flower of independence. And so I arranged this, and I thought it looked horrible. So I left it outside overnight, and I made this the next morning. So that was the last image in the tulip book. This is where I wanted to be when I talked about the other image. I photographed thistles. I showed you a few of them. The garden had also become important to me in terms of my work, and this particular year I had a lot of ornamental thistles growing, and I was going away for 6 weeks. They were just coming into seed, and I thought, if I leave them, my garden will just be thistles next year. And so I cut them back, and I put the pieces in a rubbish bag, and I left it. And when I came back, I went to put something else in the rubbish bag, and the thistles were superb. They were slightly mouldy, they were silvered, they were beautiful. And I had an idea of how I wanted to photograph them. I wanted a sense of things either merging into or emerging from the ground. And I made my first photographs, and they didn't work like that. The thistles remained very separate. And I thought, what can I do? And I thought, well, I could use double exposure. So I laid out my still life, photographed it, then I removed it and photographed the ground that it was on. And this gave me the effect that I wanted. They also, for me, were like landscape photographs. They didn't really look like still life. They were like the corner of a fecund landscape. And the series was called Chimerical Landscapes, Fictional Landscapes. And I liked the idea of fiction. So I did a number of pieces of work. This was the second one. At that time, I had an Irish mother outlaw, and I went to visit her in Ireland. She has an amazing garden, and we began collecting bits. And she thought this was a nice game, so she began as well. And I came back to England with 3 boxes of bits, and I thought I should make an image for Chris. So this is an imaginary reconstruction of her garden. And I was intrigued by that because the chimerical landscapes had no reference in reality. This is a fiction in the same way, but it refers to a particular place, to a particular garden. And a couple of years previously, I had terraced my garden, and I'd collected a lot of bits, and I'd kept them, but I hadn't done anything with them. But I got them out, and I made a series called The Garden, Fragments of a History. And to me, it was a sort of archaeology. So the old rusty objects you can see fading into the background were things that were dug up. Some of the things are mine, like the broken pots. The skull belonged to one of my favourite cats who I buried and then accidentally dug up again. And the flowers relate to a particular period of the year. So there are all these different layers of time. Because I don't live there anymore, it's no longer my garden. So its history has changed again. So a sort of archaeology. I can't remember what comes next. Oh yes, handmade books. I began making books in 1984. And I had a certain idea at that time what I wanted to do. I very rarely have a complete collection of my photographs. I thought if I print a sequence and make it into a book, that will be there, that will be done. I've never done it because other things became more interesting. Those are just a few of my books. Can we classify this as a certain sort of landscape? If one defines oneself as being part of the natural kingdom, where does nature end and humanity begin? Then this is my den. I spent 10 years photographing in my living room, which is quite a small room. 12 feet by 9, something like that. I'm fascinated, a sort of still life. I'm fascinated by the way things accumulate. So none of these photographs are set up. They are all responding to something which had happened on my table. What I also do is put images together. So these are 2 end prints, because for the last 10, 12 years, I'm not quite sure, I've worked in colour. I take my film to the local booths. I get end prints, and then I make those end prints into books. And I make families of books. So these are from a family which is either called Workspace or Interior Light. And I love putting images together because of the change of perspective, the change of scale that one can get. So in the top image, the part on the left is quite distant, the part on the right quite close, but there's this sort of homogeneity between them because of the light and the shade. Those are the frontispieces of 2 of my books. I have got some handmade books with me. I've got them upstairs, so I can't, I feel, just leave them out. But if someone wants to come up and say, show me your books, then I will. So yes, interior light, workspace, windowsill. A few years ago, a friend gave me a prism, and at some point I began photographing it, and I got fascinated, so I filled my windowsill with glass in various forms. I think this work is finished. I haven't done any this year, so I think I finished photographing my living room. These are some of my windowsill. And they became for me something else. They became like ruined cities, the detritus of human stupidity. Why do I like books? I like books because I hate having a piece of work which isn't considered. If one's making an exhibition, one works towards it, one selects, one edits, one sequences. If you're not working towards an exhibition, what do you do with the work? And so what I love to do is to make books. So this colour work, I have no control over the process at all. So my black and white work was all about control of process. This is about the moment of seeing and then the process of sequencing and ordering to make a book. Will we allow these as a certain sort of domestic landscape? I think we should. One thing that intrigues me, I have a very small room. I've been photographing there continuously for, I started in 2005. How long's that? 11 years? And you can look at all the photos, you have no idea what the room is like. And that intrigues me because photography is supposed to be about fact, about description, about showing us a space with some sort of truth. And of course it isn't. What is the nature of this invisible thing called light, whose presence calls everything into view except itself? This has been my mantra for about 30 years. The idea that intrigues me is to make a photograph which transcends its obvious subject and becomes about light. Because for the photograph we are dependent on light, but we generally use light for the way it describes surface. If one tries to make photographs which become about light, where the emphasis shifts, how does one do it? It's probably impossible, but it's an interesting question to ask oneself. The other area that I've photographed fairly extensively in the last 10 years is my garden. And I think I have made photographs which become close to becoming about light. So I've made families of books about my living room, families of books about my garden, a number of titles. So light is in a lot of titles, leaf light, about 4 different titles. The last one, which we'll come to in a moment, was called, Seduced by Light. This is the cover of a book. So we talked this morning about images becoming painterly, photographs becoming painterly. People look at a lot of my colour and say, well, this is painterly. Of course, it's purely photographic, because I can only see like this through the optical system of a camera. I can't look at the area that I'm photographing and say, that's what I'm going to photograph, because I can't see it. I have to look through the camera. I have to discover it through the process of minute movements, focusing. And it relates back to the photographs that I made in the mid-50s. Do you remember them? So it went underground for a long period and then came up again, actually at the end of the 80s. Yeah, this is a page of a book. So this is the intimate landscape, I suppose. It's a very pleasurable game, making a grid like that. Finding a structure within the grid. But I'm fascinated by the way light can manifest itself. This is last year. I hadn't taken a camera out of the house since 2000, year 2000, longer than that. And then we were going to the beach and my partner wanted photographs of the edge of the sea, the sand, for work she was doing. So I took a camera and I hated it. I thought, what's this thing around my neck? Why is it there? What am I doing with it? And I made a few photographs for her, and then I put the camera away and didn't use it again. And then we went back to the coast, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm going to make a book. I'm going to make a piece of work. So this is called The Stilled and Silent Sea. That's the cover. Again, I'm joining images together, making fictions. One of the things that making books has given me is a sort of freedom. So I cut things up. The image on the left, there are 3 pieces there, one of which is upside down. I wouldn't do this with my black and white prints. Perhaps I should start. One can be too precious about these things. But with end prints, I cut them up, I do whatever I want with them. It gives me a freedom, a pleasure, a different way of looking, a different way of thinking about the work. Having once taken my camera out, I thought I have to carry on with this while the mood's there. I'd been given a book of clouds last year, and I thought I'll do a cloud diary. So last November, I photographed clouds every day. It was the most miserable November on record for I can't quite remember how many years. But I did it. I persisted. That was my first and second day. I got up on the 1st of November last year, and I looked out of the window, and there was a faint mist over everything. But I thought, well, I said I'd do it. Get out there, Blakemore, do it. Day 2 wasn't a great deal better. It became a little more interesting as the week progressed. But again, I'm using grids, playing with putting images together. Yeah, the last day of the first week got a little more exciting. Because I'm playing with images, so the image on the right is virtually the same photograph, one upside down, one the right way up. Because if you look up at clouds, how do you tell which way round they are? I don't know. This was the second week. Bottom one is Sainsbury's car park. I didn't want them to be picturesque photographs of clouds floating over idyllic landscapes. I wanted them to be cityscapes. I live in the city, so I just walked around from my house. This might be week 3, I'm not quite sure. Yeah, this is the end of week 3, a typical day. So the clouds were running down the windscreen of my car. I like the strange fictions I can make, like the image on the right, by just putting one upside down so they look like reflections until you realize that the reflection is different from what might be reflected. Sunrise, Sainsbury's car park. So I didn't particularly want drama, but sometimes drama forces itself on one. Yeah, this was when I love those TV dishes. So this is the sort of interesting question that the book proposes. Because with a lot of these images, I've actually butted 2 images together. Now this one looks as though it should work because there's a sort of continuity in the sky. But when I tried it, it didn't, and it needed that little gap. And so one can spend a lot of time deciding about gap or no gap, or wide gap or narrow gap. And the one on the left, of course, I butted up, although one of them's upside down. So these are the intriguing questions that the book proposes. I would recommend the book to anyone. Bookmaking, good thing. This was a lovely day. But I rather like that very pale grid. we've got to this year. How am I doing for time, Tim?
Yeah, you've got a couple of minutes yet.
I'm nearly there. Okay, this year I've taken my 5x4 camera out for the first time since 1986. My partner and I are artists in residence at the local arboretum. And this is where I began photographing. I love this tree, which is a black mulberry, and I thought I would photograph it through the year. And we went back later and someone had set fire to it, so there's now just a stump. And it was planted in the mid-1800s. So a return to a species of landscape, a tamed landscape, an inner city landscape, but a very pleasurable place. And Tim told me that cats were compulsory, so I thought I'd finish with a photograph of a cat. This is from a book called The Book of Schmaltz, which I made in 1984. Schmaltz was deaf, slightly crazy, and he slept phenomenally. I mean, all cats sleep phenomenally, but he was ridiculous. And I kept photographing. I suddenly thought of the sentence, the choreography of sleep. And I was so entranced by this that I thought, well, I have to make a book. Will it just go to white if I press this again? Pardon?
I'm not sure, John. I think you can leave. Are you what's the last image?
Yeah.
Oh, you can leave it there. Why don't you leave it up? Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it up.
Thank you very much indeed, John.
I just talk very briefly about the way that I work, because there was some talk about lenses and not using lenses and so on. All my 5x4 work since 1974, still life and landscape, has been done with one lens. All my 35mm colour work is made with a Nicomat. Do you remember the Nicomat?
Vaguely.
I think the Nicomat was the peak of camera production. It's all been downhill since then. And I have two lenses for it, one 50mm, one 80mm, both macro.
It's not all about the gear, is it?
No.
Inspiring talk, John. Really interesting, and I think you were asking about whether they could be considered landscapes. I think they're landscapes of your imagination, and I think
indeed.
that's the overriding the theme, really. So, thank you again.
Thank you.
We've got another half-hour break so that you can let the circulation return to any parts that might be numb. And then we return for Bruce Percy. So back here in half an hour, folks. Why did I say not for this?
But it gives me a little bit to play with, doesn't it?
Tom. Welcome back to the Green Room. I'm with John Blakemore now, who's just given what I thought was a really beautiful talk about his work. I said to you last night when we met that I actually first met you in about 1980 or 81.
Yes, I couldn't remember.
No, it's okay. I was a young spotty student in those days, and I remember being kind of blown away by the quality of the printing and the imagery. You were doing a lot of those kind of multiple exposure sequences then, but I don't think that I fully appreciated the power of the sequence, and it really underlies all of your work, doesn't it?
It always has, more or less consciously. I mean, in the beginning it wasn't very conscious, but I've always wanted to collect images. If I photograph something new, then I want the images to go around it. The single image is not sufficient. So
Right.
Always. Minor White called them constellations, and I think this is a beautiful word for it, a constellation of images.
Because what most photographers seem to do, I think, is to, well, not most, perhaps. That's a sweeping generalisation, which I understand is always good. But what a lot of photographers do is strive for the masterpiece, the single amazing image, and in the process they collapse all the possibilities. So you're left with just that one. And you want to would it be fair for me to say that what you want to do is to explore the whole range of possibilities?
Yeah, if someone talked about masterpiece, I say, well, if you're a photographer and you get up in the morning and you stretch and you say, today I'm going to make a masterpiece, it's really hard, and you'll probably be disappointed. But if you're working on something for a long period of time, then you get up and you say, I'm carrying on photographing tulips or whatever today. And you have a strand of work that you've been making, and work fits within that. I see it as being like a chain, and each image is a link in that chain.
Right.
And some of those links will last, they'll become important, some won't. But the process is a process of exploration, of continuing to photograph.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a great advocate of series, although ironically I don't make series myself. But I can see the power of the series. I think it's well. You talked at one point in your presentation about how you felt that you weren't kind of the right temperament to be a freelancer, mm-hmm. And I don't think I'm the right temperament. I don't have the right temperament to make series, but I can see the huge power in it. And when Joe Cornish and I give workshops, we quite often talk about the curse of the masterpiece, because people they put this burden upon themselves.
Yeah. Well, there have been certain points in the tulip work where I made images where I thought, how can I go beyond those?
Right.
Because they seem to be a summation. But like, you carry on working and you work from that, and you reach a point where you begin something different, and another strand begins, but it's all part of that sort of continuity of work.
Yeah. Was it Picasso who said that works of art are never completed, merely abandoned? I suppose you get to a point where you feel that you've said what you want to say, but then you returned to things, didn't you? You've during that talk you say that you've returned to themes that you've maybe not touched for 15 or 20 years in some cases.
Well, the thing that I suppose surprised me most was the sort of colour that I've been making, which sort of re-emerged again from the late 50s, and I hadn't thought about it in that intervening period.
Right.
But then suddenly I was working and seeing in the same sort of way again.
That was very interesting to me, because you talked about treating the camera lens as if it was a kaleidoscope, and then in those later colour images, you're flipping the images one above another as the prism in a kaleidoscope does, as the mirrors do.
I hadn't thought of it like that, but yeah.
So do you think that was just a subconscious?
Yes, it was
link?
just a decision to work in grids.
Yeah.
Because I wanted another level of complexity, and the grid allows all sorts of different relationships. I mean, it's very complicated because you have relationships in all sorts of directions, but it's very intriguing to do.
Yeah. Well, they're beautiful to do, but to look at. But I wonder, do you feel the need to explain or are you happy that people will get whatever they get out of?
I'm happy that people get whatever they get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's much the best way to do it, because for me, one of my frustrations with a lot of art practice is too much wordy explanation of.
Yeah, and the explanation is often more interesting than the images.
Yeah. I was very interested that you said that you're maybe more in love with words than you are with images.
Yes.
Yeah. So why did you not become a writer?
I don't know.
Right. Okay.
I don't know.
There wasn't a point where you said, "No, I'm not going to do that." I suppose it's a bit
No,
like Ansel
no.
Adams. Why did he not become a concert pianist? I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah. Well, no, I love the activity of making images. It's been something I've always done. I mean, as a child, I drew and painted all the time. When I discovered photography, I became a photographer, although I still do quite complex doodles on occasions. But that process of making images has also always been important to me. But in terms of being engaged emotionally, I think probably language is more powerful for me than most images.
It's easier to constrain the interpretation, isn't it? And I wonder if, this is projection maybe, because I think from my perspective it's certainly how I feel, but for me, that the freedom that photography gives you to step away from a single interpretation is one of the things that's fascinating about it.
And it's something that beginning photographers find very difficult. I mean, students make a photograph and say, this is about, and they tell you precisely what it's about.
Yeah.
And for someone else, the image isn't about that at all.
No.
It's not necessarily about that.
Yeah.
This is one of the problems with sequencing, because all my exhibitions were carefully sequenced, but most viewers don't look at sequences of photographs. They would step up, they would see an image that interests them, they would go and look at that, and they wouldn't necessarily think about the relationship left and right that image has.
Placing within a grid, does that make it harder for them to step away from that?
I think it probably does, yeah.
Because they have to, in some way, absorb the whole.
Yeah,
and then they start to see those relationships.
As well, because you move through a book, whereas you walk into a gallery and you've got a wall of images and you are free to enter that wall whenever you want.
And you've probably noticed this, that a lot of people, when they pick up a photography book, they actually flick from the back to the front. Presumably, with one of your books, that would ruin the sequence, because you. Well,
yes, it does.
Yeah. So how do you feel when you see somebody do that? You fall into that trap. I've always been interested also in the way that I think you have a painter's or an illustrator's eye. The arrangement of the tulips, the arrangement of the thistles, and you talked about referencing with the tulips the kind of history of the representation of tulips, and some of that was obviously very conscious, but some was I felt was very just intuitive and emotional.
I looked at a lot of books. I mean, I collected books of botanical illustration. Most of the painters who are the canon have at some point in their life painted flowers, and so I looked at those, and they're not immediately obvious references, but one picks up things, and the notion of the botanical drawing, the specimen, and then the celebration. So one gets different ideas. It's the same with the books. You know, I photographed within my room for 10 years, but there are a lot of different books, and often they happen when I recognise a sort of series of images which have a certain sort of relationship. So I showed some there that were from a book called Workspace Chiaroscuro. When I sequenced that book, I must have laid out 100 end prints on the table. And I thought, well, how can I sequence this? And then as you look, you gradually find elements that relate, and you find images that will fit together. Because I don't plan those pairs of images. I discover them when I'm sequencing. I very rarely do it as a conscious thing when I'm looking through the camera.
Right, okay. I have one final question. Your black and white work is about a mastery of control, it seems to me, your darkroom technique, from the development of the film through to the actual printing, and then you step away from that entirely in the colour work, and is that very much a reaction between the two? Is it a kind of I want the freedom of not having that control?
It wasn't. I didn't think of it consciously in that way.
Right.
But I've never printed colour. I mean, I worked commercially as a photographer for a number of years. You sent colour away to be printed, and that always seemed to me to be a good idea.
Well, it was very difficult to have any control without a
Yes.
huge amount of very difficult
so
kind of
when
technique.
I began doing colour, I didn't want to be involved with that aspect of the process. It was very much for me about the moment of seeing, and then when I made the books, about the sequencing, the editing, the awareness of the work, which for me is the important thing. It's important in black and white as well. But in black and white, the process was important because I wanted the prints to in some way communicate the complexity of the landscape itself. So I wanted detail, rich tonality, all these things. With the colour, different things were important to me.
Well, beautiful, very inspiring talk. I really, really enjoyed it, and it's lovely to get some real insight into how you've worked over the years. So thank you very much indeed, John.
Thank you.
We're going to have a short break now, and then return you to the green room in a couple of minutes' time.